Horizons Public Benefit Corporation, producer of the largest and longest running annual gathering of the psychedelic community in the world, is collaborating with the Sherry Eckert Foundation to host Horizons Northwest. This 5-day psychedelic learning event will take place at the Portland Art Museum in Portland, Oregon from September 13th through the 18th. For more information on the conference programs, speakers, and to register, please visit horizonspbc.com/Northwest and use this code Psychedelics Today -NW-12 to get 12% off. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Psychedelics Today podcast. This time we have two Englishmen called David. Me, David Drapkin, and the one and only Professor David Nutt. Fantastic conversation. I literally had the strategy of let's talk about everything and anything, squeeze it into an hour. So we go all over the place. We had the opportunity of talking in person at Toronto, the From Research to Reality conference last month. Wonderful to meet him. He's been a legend in my life back in England because he's outspoken. Because he believes in the truth, that we deserve to know the truth around science and around drug policy. So he's just a fantastic person, wonderful sense of humor and incredibly down to earth for one of the most kind of quoted and cited scientist researchers in Britain. To be that down to earth and approachable, what a gift that is. Another gift of his I noticed is his role at Imperial College, being a mentor and figurehead for so many junior scientists kind of coming through the ranks. Obviously Robin Carhart-Harris and Ros Watts, but a lot of the current cohort of scientists that are going through Imperial that really look up to him. And I got to chat with quite a few of them in Toronto. It's kind of that father figure that brings authority, respect, and confidence in doing this groundbreaking work around psychedelic medicine. I love as well what Professor Nutt does through drug science. So go and check that website out around the kind of legalization and policy of drugs. And he speaks about his experience back in 2009, where the Prime Minister, I think it was Gordon Brown, fired him, sacked him because, yes, he spoke the truth around drug policy and the harms of drugs. So you probably have heard about that before, but he gets to speak about it, what it was actually like and what the scientific community felt about him getting sacked and the pressure not to release data and to tell the people about the reality of drugs. And then he speaks about Awaken, his role in that company around alcohol use disorder and the use of ketamine and their protocols, moving into the American market soon with their work, and also novel chemical entities and the intellectual property that they've developed around that at Awaken. And here is his bio. David is a psychiatrist and the Edmund J. Safra Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology in the Division of Brain Science, the Department of Medicine at Imperial College London. Here he uses a range of brain imaging techniques to explore the causes of addiction and other psychiatric disorders and to search for new treatments. He's published over 400 original research papers, a similar number of reviews and book chapters, 8 government reports on drugs, and 36 books, including one for the general public, Drugs Without the Hot Air, that won the Transmission Prize in 2014. He is currently the president of the European Brain Council and founding chair of Drug Science. Previously, he's been president of the British Association of Psychopharmacology, the British Neuroscience Association, and the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology. He broadcasts widely to the general public both on radio and television. In 2010, the Times Eureka Science magazine voted him one of the 100 most important figures in British science, and the only psychiatrist in that list. In 2013, he was awarded the John Maddox Prize from Nature Sense about science for standing up for science. Without further ado, enjoy the show. Welcome to the Psychedelics Today podcast with two Davids, David Drapkin and the one and only Professor David Nutt. It's an absolute pleasure and privilege to be with you today in Toronto. How are you doing, Dave?
Yeah, I'm doing good, actually. It's not jet-lagged yet, which is good.
Right. What time did you get in?
Well, I came in yesterday evening, and I think I woke up at about 4, so I might fade by the end of the podcast, but I'll do my best to keep going.
Yeah, I got in at 1 o'clock in the morning and then had a nightmare trying to find parking. Didn't understand like how much things cost. So, but it's good to be here. Coffee's keeping me going, which is a drug.
Yes.
First question, we'll start with an easy one. Do you support a football team back home?
It's so embarrassing to say I used to, but they were so bad I've given up.
Was it Bristol City?
Bristol Rovers.
Oh, Bristol Rovers, even worse. I used to support Birmingham City, but they were crap, so I switched to Arsenal. Much better.
Well, I'm a kind of Spurs supporter, really, because I'm so old. I remember when Spurs won the double.
When was that?
1960.
70? Oh, 60, crikey. Congratulations. I think it was the last time they won anything.
Close to. It's been very frustrating.
It's tough. So I want to get to know you, and I want our audience to get the full gamut of who you are as a man. In no more than 10,000 words, could you try and describe who you are professionally and personally, kind of the narrative journey you've been on, Dave?
So I'm a psychiatrist. I went to university to do physiology, thinking I'd just do brain research. And then I realized I was actually interested in human brains. And before I went to Cambridge, I realized that to work on humans, you needed to be a doctor. So I had a very interesting experience. I went up for my interview and they said, "Hi, Nutt. So you're coming to do natural sciences, are you?" And I said, "Well, do you mind if I change?" And of course, they got really worried. And then they had to ring around. And I had 6 interviews that day, 3 for natural science and 3 for medicine. And then I got in to do medicine and never looked back, because I'm in a position now where as a doctor, I can study the human brain using drugs. And I can heal people using drugs, and that's what I do. And I think now, looking back now over 40 years of being a research doctor, I think I've given more different classes of drugs to human beings probably than anyone alive.
And have you always specialized in psychiatric conditions?
Well, so I started off thinking I was going to be a neurologist, neuroscientist, but then I realized actually neurology is very straightforward, whereas psychiatry is much more interesting and challenging. So, and I was always fascinated by pharma. I was very lucky because as an undergraduate, my tutor at Cambridge was the guy that discovered GABA.
Oh, wow.
Jimmy Mitchell. So I was brought up on the new concept of the chemical brain, neurotransmitters being released, producing effects across the synapse. And of course, if you want to study chemicals, you've got to give other chemicals, which we call drugs. And that's why I've become a psychopharmacologist. Yeah.
How do you understand the brain as a kind of chemical, electrical, biological entity? Do you have any kind of good analogies or way of expressing it to people?
Well, there are 80 different chemicals in the brain that communicate information. And in a way, it's as if the brain was hardwired, but that little gap between neurons, that synaptic gap, gives you just a lot of flexibility. And that is why the brain is so adaptable, because if it was hardwired, you'd have to run very sophisticated programs all the time. Whereas with the chemical neurotransmitter, you've got that an amazing level of flexibility. If you just adjust the amount that comes out, that changes the gain in the other side. And also many neurons have 2 neurotransmitters in them. And one of them works at a low level and then one amplifies it. So it gives you a much greater flexibility. And some neurotransmitters are kind of simple on-off switches, like electrical switches might be, but others like serotonin, noradrenaline, dopamine, they add a kind of valence. They give you another dimension of meaning or activity or encoding different aspects of valence. So those multiple neurotransmitters make the brain much more sophisticated organ.
And expressing that in respect to, say, the default mode network and the rebus model, how does that fit in on maybe more of that kind of integrated perspective of the brain's functioning?
Yeah, so what's interesting about thinking about how the brain works is that, clearly different parts of the brain do different things. We've got nuclei, it's like bits of the brain, we got the cerebellum, it makes sure you can learn how to walk and ride a bike and speak, etc. So you download complicated memory circuits. And then you've got bits of the brain like the amygdala, which have got something to do with emotion and recognition of emotion and encoding behaviors to relate to emotion. And then on top of it all, you've got the cortex, and the cortex is essentially where you do all your organization of everything. It monitors everything beneath it, and it then comes up with decisions as to how to respond, how to react, etc. Now, most of the cortex is actually it's relatively simple in that it's mostly driven by glutamate. So glutamate turns on different parts of the cortex. And of course, different parts of the cortex do different things. The visual cortex does vision, the auditory cortex does hearing, and there's a large chunk at the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which does thinking. So those particular networks are all linked together by this transmitter glutamate. But neurotransmitters which start deeper in the brain, often from the midbrain, like serotonin, noradrenaline, they come up and they influence the activity of the cortical circuits. So when, for instance, you're looking at the default mode network, which is the network where you encode your sense of self, that can become over-engaged in disorders like depression. We don't know why that is, but I suspect it's because, at least in part, it's going to be driven by these, what we call the amine modulators, like noradrenaline or serotonin or dopamine. And at the very least, I think the content of the thinking processes are going to be driven by those transmitters. So the thoughts will go around, but the decision as to whether it's a negative thought or a positive thought could well depend on how much serotonin you've got.
And I definitely want to talk to you a bit more about ketamine as we go along. You mentioned the word, I think, glutamine or glutamatergic. So I know that, there's a few different systems. There's the serotonergic, which is more like, say, psilocybin based. And then there's a kind of glutamatergic, which is more ketamine based. How do those two different systems of the brain relate to mental illness? Or what do we know? What don't we know about that, perhaps?
Okay, so what's been fascinating in the last decade of this research with psychedelics is this understanding, this rather surprising understanding that the impact of a psychedelic drugs like psilocybin or LSD, which work on a serotonin receptor called the 5-HT2A receptor, that produces the same brain changes as a drug like ketamine, which is a blocker of glutamate receptors. Now, how can that be? And as I say, it was completely unexpected. No one would have imagined that, because ketamine is an anesthetic and psychedelics are very much the opposite of anesthetics. But it turns out that the right doses of ketamine have an impact to dysregulate brain function in a similar way to the serotonin psychedelics. And when you look at the brain imaging, or look at the electrical activity of the brain, the cortex, it's indistinguishable whether you're on ketamine or psilocybin. And that is because the mediators of this cortical activity is glutamate. And if you perturb that with ketamine, you mess it up. But the neurons which release glutamate are stimulated by serotonin, the serotonin receptors. So psychedelics stimulate the 2A receptors. They send off a massive firing of these neurons, which release a lot of glutamate. Ketamine works on a subset of these neurons, which are normally inhibitory. You block the inhibition, so the neurons fire again. So it's two different ways of producing the same activity. And in the end, glutamate's released.
A question just popped in my head, Dave, about kind of novel chemical entities. And I know you and one of your hats at Awaken, where you work, will focus on novel chemical entities. Do you know of anything around those two systems we're talking about with the glutamatergic, the serotonergic, around novel chemical entities and what could evolve there with medicines?
Well, yeah, there's a huge interest. I mean, actually, previously, there's been a massive interest in trying to manipulate the glutamate system. Many big pharma companies invested billions in trying to target the different glutamate receptors. But very few drugs came of it, probably because the system is so complicated. In fact, the only drug I know of that actually came out of the glutamate system is this anti-convulsant called perampanel, which is a particular subtype, an AMPA receptor blocker. So the glutamate system has got three major subtypes of receptors. It's got receptors which work on ion channels. It's got receptors which work on G proteins. It's got about 5 of those. It's got another receptor which is a bit unusual called the kainate receptor. So it's a really complicated system, and it's all over the brain. But when you focus on the serotonin system, it's much more localized. So if you look at the brain and you look at where these serotonin 2A receptors are, where psychedelics work, they're really localized in the parts of the brain where you do your high-level thinking and feeling and reflecting and imagining. And they're on a particular subtype of neuron. So it's much more targeted. So it's much more likely now that focusing on the serotonin system is going to give you a more refined, a more fine-grained intervention than focusing on the glutamate system. Mm-hmm. So what can we see? Well, we can see people are already looking to make new versions of things like psilocybin and LSD and DMT, which again, will have some advantages over the natural products in terms of kinetics and in terms of selectivity. And also we're working on, with Awaken, we're working on trying to find improvements on Mdma, which is actually quite a good drug. Yeah. But we'd like to see if we can. No one's ever tried to improve on Mdma, so we're seeing if we can.
I didn't know you were working on that. I know one of your studies with alcohol use disorders, you use Mdma.
That's right. We used Mdma. We did the first ever study of Mdma in the treatment of alcoholism, and showed it was really powerful. It basically tripled success rates over 9 months. 2 Mdma sessions given inside a traditional 10-week course of abstinence-based psychotherapy. It tripled outcomes. But we could possibly do better. So, I mean, the MDMA sessions are quite long. The ones we were doing we gave 125 milligrams, and then 2 hours later a 62.5 milligram top up. So people were actually going through a 6 to 7 hour trip, which was tough for them, and also very tough for the therapists, because you've got 2 therapists sitting in a room for 7 hours with someone. So we're thinking maybe we could make a shorter acting MDMA that would still give the benefit, but allow us to take the stress off the patient, to take the stress off the therapist, and even possibly allow us to do 2 patients a day. So it would actually be much more cost effective.
Okay, so that's a bit of a game changer, isn't it? Yeah.
It would be if we can get it. Yeah. The problem is no one really knows how MDMA works. So no one really knows how to make a better version, because we don't know what we're trying to improve. We know what MDMA does, but we don't know if that's how it works. And I've got 1 or 2 ideas that are a bit left field, which I'm not going to share here because they're commercially confidential. But I've got some ways I think we can tinker with the molecule to make it both better, or we can tinker with other molecules that are shorter lived to mimic the effects of MDMA with novel chemical entities.
Would you describe yourself as a molecule tinkerer? Like, is that something you literally do yourself, or do you have other people doing that?
Oh no, I'm not a chemist. No, I've just I'm a pharmacologist. So we have chemists. Yeah. We say to the chemist, look, got this structure of MDMA. Now go away and work out where there's patentable opportunities, where there's ways can we find other structures which could give you the same kind of effects. Then we do the pharmacology, and it's all done by contract. We don't have any laboratories because it's cost effective to go out to people who've got them set up all the time. There's a lot of commercial companies out there. And then so we design new molecules. My chemists design new molecules. Then we get them tested. We look at them. And then we say, okay, maybe we tinker a bit here. But I love doing that. I mean, I love seeing that. The hunting down of a new, better molecule is one of the most satisfying things you've ever done. And I've been doing it, since 1988 when I set up a research unit in Bristol University.
Amazing. Yeah. My wife is a musician and she reads music. So I'm just thinking, does it feel like reading music a bit when you kind of look at a molecule and just sense that's what it sounds like, or that's what it does in the brain?
That's what the chemists do. The chemists look at the molecule and they see the vibrations here and electric charge here. And actually, when they do, they've got these wonderful programs now which produce these sort of graphical illustrations of the electrical charge around molecules, which are quite, actually, they're really quite beautiful. Whether that's useful in terms of inventing new ones, we don't know yet, but we're trying.
Yeah. I want to really look at Imperial College very briefly because I'm proud of what they have done and who they are, what they represent. I know you've had a significant role to play there. And when I think of the people that pop into my head, I think of people like Mendel Kaelin, Ros Watts, David Rizzo, Chris Timmerman, and Robin Carhart-Harris. Yeah. So amazing people, like a golden generation of scientists, researchers. What's it like being part of that group of amazing people?
Well, it's bloody hard work because I got to raise all the money. So that's my job. I raise the money, they spend it.
Yeah.
And that's the better way, because they have the ideas, they do all the work, they do all the clever things. I just make sure that they don't write anything too outrageous, and keep them on track and make sure, they try to build their careers.
Yeah. No, I'm so proud of what they're doing, and I imagine you are too. And
very much so.
The study that Robin Carhart-Harris et al. Did on Escitalopram, so also known as Lexapro for psilocybin, that's pretty big deal, monumental, I'd say, or it could be. And different people analyze the data differently. So I'd love to hear, from looking at the data under the hood, what does the data say to you there about that comparative study?
So look, shall I just give you a bit of the backstory?
Yeah.
So maybe go back a long way. I started working with psychedelics and brain imaging with Robin Carhart-Harris. He came to join me to do a PhD with me 16, 17 years ago. And he actually wanted to look at the influence of psychedelics on psychoanalysis. But I said, I don't know anything about psychoanalysis, so I'm not going to do that. But I'm quite interested in looking at the effect of psychedelics on the brain. So after training him for 3 years on the effects of Mdma in the brain, we did the first psychedelic experiments. And my interest was simply to understand what the nature of the psychedelic state was, because no one had ever done it before. And because it was illegal and difficult. And it was a challenge, and we fought our way through all the regulations, and we did the first study, and the effects were just so completely mind-blowing. Because rather unlike what Timothy Leary had proposed, the psychedelics would turn on the brain. They don't. They turn off the brain, and they turn off the parts of the brain in which you lodge your sense of self, the default mode. Oh, we thought that is amazing, and we got several very high-profile papers published. We went on and did the same with LSD, and it's saying the same thing. But it became clear to us as we were doing these experiments that two things. One, the first was often people coming out of the scanner, and these are normal volunteers going into getting the psychedelics in the scanner. They often come out and say they felt better, and they often say, "No, my mind feels clearer. I'm more in tune with nature. Everything seems more meaningful and more connected." So I thought, well, that's interesting. It's sort of an antidepressant effect. And in the same time, or just a bit before that, Roland Griffith's group in Johns Hopkins was giving normal, healthy, middle-aged people psilocybin, the same dose as us, just to see what happened and see how it affected their sense of wellness and well-being. And many of them said it was a profoundly beneficial effect. You think, a 50-year-old man lying in a couch for a few hours with a bit of mushrooms comes out and says, "Wow, I'm changed. This is one of the 5 most important things in my life." It ranks alongside getting married or having children. And we thought, well, that's interesting. These profound changes, maybe they have clinical use. And at that time, I didn't really know there was an enormous literature on the clinical value back in the 50s and 60s. And the other third thing to say was that the signatures in the brain were so consonant with the idea that it would be antidepressant. Psilocybin would switch off the parts of the brain which cause depression, like the default mode. So we thought, well, maybe let's give it a go. And in fact, we were very lucky, because the only time we've ever got any money from our government was when 2012, the Medical Research Council put a call out for new treatments for resistant depression. So we thought, well, let's give it a go. Didn't expect anything to happen. Got funded. I was amazed. And so then we did the first study of psilocybin in resistant depression. And it was the biggest, most powerful treatment, single-dose treatment of resistant depression has ever been. Transformed people's lives, sometimes permanently. Some of those people are still well. Most of them, the depression came back after months, but it's the immediate impact was overwhelming. And then we began to think, well, how does this work? And we came up with a theory in 2017. We published a paper comparing traditional antidepressants with psychedelics. And we had a theory. They work in completely different parts of the brain, and they work through completely different serotonin receptors. And then about the same time, we got funding from a charity, the Alexander Mosley Charitable Foundation, which was funded by the legacy of a young guy, Alexander Mosley, who had committed suicide. He was a drug addict, a drug user. He was depressed, and he killed himself in his 20s. And his family said, take his legacy and turn it into research. So we thought, what should we do? And we did 2 things. We did the Mdma alcohol study to try to see if we could help people with addictions. And then we did this study testing our theory that SSRIs, like escitalopram, which we use, worked in a different way in the brain to psychedelics. So we set up a study to do that. And it turned out to be one of the most exciting things we've ever done. So in the end, we discovered that we could get people's depression lifted through psychedelics faster than Escitalopram, but over time, at 6 weeks, the depression scores weren't so different. Psychedelics, psilocybin did better. But when we looked at the brain measures, they were fundamentally different in that psilocybin had worked in the cortex to open up the cortex and make it more connected, to break down the rigid ways of thinking and the rigid connections in the brain, which we could measure using electrical and also fMRI measures. And the other side of the coin, our prediction was escitalopram would work to suppress stress reactivity in the amygdala. And it did. And in fact, we're presenting that data for the first time to the world tomorrow here.
Tomorrow. Wonderful.
Yeah. And so we've kind of shown, we've tested our theory. These drugs work in different parts of the brain and do different things. And that is why, and it's very exciting. So now depressed people have a choice. They can either go, if psychedelics were legal, they'd have a choice. They could either have the psychedelic therapy or they could have the SSRI therapy, and they would produce different effects.
That was beautifully summarized. And that last piece, to me, speaks to how I interpreted some of the findings from that Escitalopram study, is that it's not just about symptom alleviation.
That's right.
There are so many other positive symptoms and expressions of a vibrant life.
Yes, that's right.
That psilocybin enables as a catalyst, almost as a fertilizer that allows you to grow and expand with that neuroplasticity.
Yeah. Well, that's the third point. Actually, I mean, we need to talk about neuroplasticity, because one of the remarkable things about this research is that it's been so. The reality is that the psychedelic impact on depression has been so powerful. It's changed the whole narrative about how we think about depression. Our one study in resistant depression spawned 40 companies now are working on psilocybin for depression, which is amazing. I mean, it's far too many. There can't be that. It's not really much space in the field. But the point is, it's been a spark to this amazing expansion. Why? Because for the last 40 years, there's not been any innovation in terms of mechanisms in treating depression ever. All the drugs we have today are essentially safer derivatives of the drugs we invented in the 1950s. So this is a new approach, and that's really, really exciting. So we've got this first study showing, wow, you can transform people's mood for weeks or months with a psychedelic. And it's all about how the psychedelic breaks down the repetitive thinking processes and how it allows people to see new ways of thinking. But that study then provoked preclinical scientists to ask the question, well, hang on, what's going on in the brain? And there have been a number of groups have now looked into the brains using animal models where they can go and see what's going on, and they can cut the brains up and slice them up and have a look. And wow, after psychedelics and also after ketamine, which also you can use to treat depression, there's a growth of synapses. There's what we call neuroplasticity. Yeah. And that then is a wonderful explanation as to why you get these enduring effects, because you can think differently under the psychedelic, and then you can lay down the insights that you get from the psychedelic experience into long-lasting changes in attitude. So it's a triple whammy. What psychedelics do is they break the old patterns. They allow you to understand perhaps why you were depressed. Many of our patients for the first time could go back to their past and say, wow, that's what happened to provoke it. You can think differently about that, and you can think about new ways of thinking. And then you've got neuroplasticity to help you deal with the psychotherapy and really benefit maximally from the psychotherapy that happens afterwards.
So hearing you speak, David, and knowing psychedelic therapy the way that I do as well, it's just something I want to get on the rooftops and shout about. This is game changing. It's such a different paradigm for treating illness. It's not about illness. So how does this translate to policy, to research, to just people's attitudes and stigma around psilocybin, ketamine, Mdma?
Yeah. Well, we are beginning to see the public changing. Patients are changing. Patients are asking for the treatment. We can't give it to them because these drugs are still illegal under the UK Misuse of Drugs Act, under the UN conventions. There's no country in the world where they're legal apart from natural products like ayahuasca in Latin America. So we've got to get our politicians, our policymakers to admit that these drugs should never, ever have been put in Schedule 1. They were put in Schedule 1, which says they're very harmful, which they're not, and they have no medical value, which they do. And it's actually, it's immoral now, reprehensible that politicians could not see that. And legal challenges are going on in many countries, including Canada, here where we are now in the UK. And also internationally, there's a group of us have set up a campaign to take on the WHO, because we now have, I think, over 1,000 patients have benefited from a psilocybin therapy. And in the recent times, let alone back in the 50s and 60s. And we think if we go to the WHO, we can prove to them that it is a medicine, in which, and in the same way as they eventually conceded that cannabis was a medicine, they will have to concede that psilocybin is a medicine. I think we will win that argument in the next year or so. The problem will be going to the UN, because the UN still hasn't accepted that cannabis is a medicine, because the UN is, at least the UN Office of Drugs and Crime is essentially occupied by people whose jobs require drugs to be illegal. If drugs were decriminalized, they'd lose their jobs. So
Catch-22.
They're not rushing to, and also countries like Russia and China have taken on the mantle of America in being, the war on drugs. So, but I think if the WHO conceded it was a medicine, most sensible Western countries would say, okay, then we'll loosen it. We won't make them legal, but we'll allow them to be used for medicine.
And maybe just it's a good time to talk about drug science directly. Can you tell us about your kind of the mission and vision of drug science? You've got your podcast, which is great. What are you trying to achieve, would you say?
So Drug Science is a charity that I set up in 2009. What happened in 2009?
I've got it here. Yeah, you were the drug czar and you lost your job.
I got sacked. I was sacked by the Labour government just before the 2010 election because they wanted to show they were tough on drugs. And I said two things which they did not like. I said that ecstasy was less harmful than horse riding, and that LSD was less harmful than alcohol. And it was the latter one that drove the world mad. It was a completely surreal day, because we've been doing analysis for 9 years on the comparative harms of drugs as part of my job as the drugs the chief drugs advisor. So, in order to advise the government on the harms of drugs, you've got to assess the harms of drugs. We assessed the harms of drugs in a very thorough way and discovered that LSD was less harmful than alcohol. And it was, I remember the day very well. How could I ever forget it? I was on the Today program, which is the British morning breakfast public affairs program, news program. And the interviewer, I think it was probably some guy called Justin. He said, "Are you seriously telling me that LSD is less harmful than alcohol?" And I said, "Of course it is. Everyone knows that. We've all known that for 50 years. And he said, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah." And the world went absolutely mad, because that was a 3-minute interview. And that was over. And I tried to leave the studio. And he said, no, hang on. That was Radio 4. We got Radio 2 here. We got Radio 5 here. And we've got BBC News, and we got World Service. And by the end of that day, I'd done 10 interviews. I was on the front page of USA Today the next day. I mean, the world went mad, because for the first time, really since 1967 ban on LSD, a scientist had told the truth about LSD. And people were genuinely interested, but also horrified. Politicians were horrified because I was breaking the mold. And so they sacked me the next day. And then I was very lucky. A philanthropist who'd made quite a bit of money on the London Stock Exchange through share dealing said, "Look, I'll give you the money to set up an independent committee." We called it initially the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs, to tell the truth about drugs. And now that's been going now for 12 years. It's grown enormously. We've got about 15 people working for us. It's a huge international charity that tells the truth about drugs. And you go on the website, and it's a vast information base on. It's got slides. It's got my podcast. It's got publications. We've got one of the world's largest databases on medical cannabis. We do an enormous amount, and it's a great place for patients or parents or the media to go to find out the truth about drugs.
So I want to ask you a question, David, about drug policy and I think the psychology collectively around drugs, kind of this hysteria in a sense. And you've spoken about it during kind of the Labour era that time, but also just thinking, is there a difference in psychology around drugs, say you said China and Russia, but also looking at America and England and comparing it maybe to Portugal or Amsterdam or even here in Canada where we're at? Is there a different kind of psychology looking at how we see each other, like society and culture?
Huge differences. I mean, the problem is the Americans are Puritans. And the Puritans drove the temperance movement. They actually managed to ban alcohol in the States in the 1920s, and that was the start of really the war on drugs. Really began with the war on alcohol, which then, when alcohol was made legal, it was transmuted into the war on cannabis, and then the war on cocaine and heroin, basically, and then it was turned up another notch by Nixon trying to deflect attention from the failed war in Vietnam by creating hysteria about black people and hippies in his 1967 election campaign, where he came up with the idea of a war on drugs because drugs were the biggest threat.
Number one public enemy.
And of course, it was a brilliant campaign. It was all lies. His advisor, John Ehrlichman, said afterwards, of course, it was a lie, but it worked. And the saddest thing of all is that in the UK, our drugs policy has been effectively dictated by the Americans ever since. The 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act was essentially brought in at the behest of Americans. Now, other countries, particularly the Netherlands and Portugal, basically are not subservient to the US. And the Dutch basically gave two fingers to them 40 years ago. And they said, well, we're not going to ban all cannabis. We're going to have cannabis cafes so that our young people can access cannabis in a safe way without being offered heroin and crack or cocaine. They separated the hard and soft drug markets and were vilified and attacked for decades by the Americans and by the UN and WHO. But they basically hung in there. And also they're very clever because although the rest of the world pretty much banned psilocybin, they only banned the mushroom, the fruiting bodies. They didn't ban the truffles. So they've had headshots. So the Dutch were really smart and some of the most rational people on earth. And then a bit later, we're talking about now, in turn of the century, the Portuguese economy was collapsing under the use of drugs, which like heroin, the rise of AIDS, etc., the criminality associated. And they just said, well, let's try a different approach. Let's try decriminalization and let's treat drug addicts as human beings and help them get off the addiction rather than put them in prison. And that's been one of the greatest success stories in the history of drug interventions. In the 15 years we have data since the Portuguese experiment was instigated, the Portuguese have reduced opiate deaths to 1/3 of what they were before. In the same 15 years in Britain, using prohibitionist policies, we've doubled our deaths from opiates. And that, frankly, is that's an insult to humanity that we've pursued policies which we know are actually killing people.
Yeah, and even worse in America with 100,000 people dying last year and with fentanyl in particular. And is the government doing anything? They're still criminalized. And New York actually just opened a safe injection site, I think, a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, so we're beginning. Canada's been really ahead of the game. I remember 15 years ago going to the safe injecting sites in Vancouver, which is just an amazing. It was a old cinema converted. They had, I think, like 10 booths from which people could inject. But more than that, it wasn't just keeping people alive from injecting, but afterwards they could have tea and coffee, they could meet social workers. You could begin to help them get back into a different life if they wanted to. So it was just to me, it was just a no-brainer. But we still don't have one in England. In Scotland, there's Awakn.
I've seen that. Yeah, I read about that.
Yeah, he's on you can listen to him. He's Peter Krykant. He's on one of my podcasts. And he's managed to avoid, he's been arrested a couple of times, but they let him off because they realize he's saving lives.
Yeah. And we're talking about harm reduction. Let's just give it a name.
Yes, we are.
We're reducing harm. We're reducing deaths and, a disease that people get from using dirty needles and overdoses.
But it's only in the last couple of years that the Home Office in the UK have put in any of their documents, the term harm reduction was denied as a term for 20 years by the Home Office. Why? Because the Americans didn't like the term.
I want to ask you about something that is incredibly topical right now in America. in psychedelics that's happening in Oregon, secondary to the
Yes.
referendum they had there, Measure 109, where I think 56%, something like that, voted to have their own psilocybin service separate and outside of the FDA. They said, we want it. And so the
Now, let me correct you on that.
Go ahead, yeah.
It's not psilocybin, it's mushrooms.
Right.
And it's a really important distinction.
Go ahead. Where's that?
Well, in the sense that it's a natural product as opposed to a pharmaceutical product. And they're not making available these mushrooms or the therapy centers for mental illness, they're for well-being. And I think this is truly one of the most fascinating social experiments there's ever been. And I just hope they monitor it, because the problem is in America, when cannabis was effectively decriminalized for medical, it was taken out of Schedule 1 by the states. It's still under federal law, cannabis is still Schedule 1, but the states, one by one, I think now 30 states have got medical cannabis. So yeah, probably 230 million Americans have access to medical cannabis. And about, I think, 17 states, like 150 million people have got access to legal cannabis. But the federal government will not fund any research on the value of it because it's still illegal. And you just hope they're not as stupid with the Oregon experiment, because it's a fantastic way of, now we can see whether public access to a well-being substance like magic mushrooms in safe settings can actually improve quality of life in people, reduce anxiety and distress at subclinical levels, and also maybe even reduce things like suicide. So this is a really exciting time, and we just hope that people can research it properly. Yeah.
I feel the same way. I'm so happy you said that, Dave. And thanks for correcting me. The Oregon has said they're not going to allow kind of synthesized versions of psilocybin. It's just kind of, coming from the botanical Psilocybe cubensis, which means a lot of the kind of corporate IP players that are working with psilocybin aren't going to be involved there. It's just people growing real mushrooms, and it still gets tested. It's still pure and safe, and people can get it without needing a diagnosis. So
That's
it's
right.
really,
Right.
You still go through an evaluation, but you don't have to be pathologized. You can just be known as, they want to use it for whatever reasons.
Yeah. It's very exciting. It may be that the odd trip will keep people well, or maybe, a bit of microdosing. It's hard to research microdosing because a microdose is as illegal as a macrodose. A molecule of psilocybin is as illegal as a kilo, because unfortunately the international laws don't make any distinction between amounts. It is beyond absurd.
Yeah. I'm going to change tack and go down an Awaken path with you.
Yes.
A huge fan of what you're doing there. I think you've got a stellar cast of people. For folks that are listening, can you tell us a wee bit about Awaken, like what you're trying to do over there?
So Awaken Life Sciences is a company that was set up a couple of years ago to try to move psychedelics into therapy. And they asked me about a year ago to join them as chief research officer. So and now I'm partly with them and still half time with Imperial College. And actually they bought the database of Mdma therapy that Ben Sessa and I had built up from Imperial. They also bought the database on ketamine for the treatment of alcohol use disorder from Exeter University. And really great, we've got Professor Celia Morgan, who's another scientist on the team. So we've got two of the three professors of psychopharmacology in Britain on the Awaken team, plus Ben Sessa, who's a very experienced therapist. So it's a great team. And the vision is, and we're achieving the vision, is to create clinics in which we can do psychedelic therapy. Now, of course, the only legal psychedelic in Britain at present is ketamine. So we're starting with ketamine, and we're doing ketamine therapy for addiction and for alcoholism and for depression and for other disorders that where there's an evidence base, like anorexia and obesity, etc. So there's a clinic in Bristol, there's a clinic in London, there's also a clinic in Oslo, and they're beautiful clinics. They've been developed and built to a very high standard and we've got trained doctors, trained therapists. And we offer something which is not offered elsewhere in the UK. People who want to have psychedelic therapy can now come and have it at Awaken. And it's not that expensive. It's about a third the price of having a hip replacement. So for people with chronic mental illness or addiction, that's pretty good value.
Yeah. It's not code on the NHS, is it? So it is kind of self-pay, but it's not astronomical.
No, it's not astronomical. No, the treatments, the therapy, it's either 3 or 4 ketamine sessions, and they cost between £6,000 and £7,500. It's not on the NHS yet, but the NHS are looking at us with great interest. Because if we get the same outcomes in our clinics as Celia Morgan got in her trial, the CARE trial of ketamine plus mindfulness for alcoholism, and Ben got in his trial of MDMA for alcoholism, if we get the same outcomes, then we will be really cost effective. Because, for instance, the NHS is often paying £50,000 to £60,000 per patient to put them into a residential care for months, and then very often after they come out, they relapse within days. So this could be a way of saving NHS money eventually. But what they're saying at present is, look, run for a year, collect data maybe on a few hundred people, and then let's look at the data. And if it looks as promising as we think it will do, then we'll see if we can buy into you rather than other services.
And all going well, how could this protocol and ketamine as a medicine find its way into the NHS system, like particularly from the addiction perspective? Like, could rehabs start the protocol and then kind of discharge to outpatient?
One of the great achievements that Awaken has made is we've got approval from the CQC, the Care Quality Commission, to have a Schedule II drug, ketamine, used off license without having to nominate each patient independently. So they've approved the treatment in principle, and that is a major breakthrough. And to be honest, I don't think there's any need for the NHS to do it. It might be much better if they just contract it. In the same way as the NHS contracts out all hernia operations to the private sector because it's faster and quicker, they contract out a lot of other surgical operations. I think, why not contract this out? A lot of cataracts are contracted out. I think rather than have the NHS set this up, it might be simpler to have us providing to the NHS. The question is, could we develop enough clinics to do that? And the answer is probably no. So yes, I think at one level, you're right. At some point, we're going to have to set up clinics in the NHS, but we can then potentially do that as oversee them, get the training done, monitor them.
Have you been to the clinics in Norway, by the way?
I've not been to the Norway clinic, no. But
how come that? It seems quite random. There must be something quite special over there.
So why Norway? Yeah. No, Norway was because there was an American there, and he was an emergency room doctor who realized the value of ketamine to treat people with trauma disorders. And he kind of he pioneered it. He basically started doing ketamine treatments in Norway for people with chronic disorders that were stress-related, like depression and addiction. And he's called Lowen. And we heard of him. And in fact, we got our staff trained by him because we couldn't train our staff on ketamine in Britain because ketamine was an illegal drug. So they went to Norway and got trained there and then came back and started doing it here. And then we were so impressed with him that we brought him into the company.
Lovely. Oh, that's a nice story. So far we've been talking about Awaken's work with alcohol use disorder, MDMA and ketamine, and is recently, you've been announcing quite a lot around behavioral addictions as well.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more about that because that's, alcohol obviously massive problems, but so's behavioral addictions.
So one of the really exciting things about psychedelic therapy for addiction is that it works on brain circuits rather than specifically on the chemicals which are targeted by drugs. So up till now, the approach to drug addiction has been to say, okay, here's a drug, here's heroin. What does heroin do? Heroin works on the opiate receptor, the mu opiate receptor. What do? Well, we block that. We've got naltrexone. Great, we've got a treatment for heroin addiction. Only problem is patients won't take it. So then we say, well, hang on, what else could we do? We could give them an agonist at the opiate receptor called methadone or buprenorphine. Great, they will take that, but they're still addicted. Now, and the same has been true for nicotine, and the same is true for alcohol. It's proven even very difficult to do the same for cocaine. There's nothing to work for cocaine. Now, about 20 years ago, I started doing brain imaging on addiction, and we did the first heroin brain addiction study, and we realized that the brain circuit of heroin addiction was the same brain circuit as cocaine addiction, and the same as alcohol addiction. And we began to think maybe there's a circuit for addictive behaviors. And that would then also apply to behavioral addictions, not just drug addictions. And there's a circuit. When we know the circuit, it's well characterized now in humans. It's well characterized in animals. It's a 4 parts of the brain work together to actually predispose to addiction. Psychedelics disrupt those circuits, and so they can work in behavioral addictions. And now we have data from Celia Morgan's group that you can get an effect on gambling, you can get an effect on internet addiction, etc. So this is a revolution in the sense it's got a broader implications across the whole range of addictions.
Yeah. I've got a sense that psychedelics have this trans-diagnostic ability, and we're talking about like people don't need a diagnosis. They can just want psychedelic for wellness reasons, but it could be that it's addiction, it's trauma, it's anxiety, it's depression, lots of things that it helps with.
My theory is that psychedelics work on what we in psychiatry call the internalizing disorders. They're disorders in which people get locked into thinking processes which they don't want, which they know are stupid in many cases, and which are very destructive, but which they can't stop. And I think any internalizing disorder, whether that's depression, OCD, anorexia, addictions, can be disrupted by psychedelics. I'm not sure they're going to work for everything. They're probably not going to work for schizophrenia. They might make it worse. They're probably not going to work for mania. They might not even work for bipolar depression. They probably won't work for ADHD. It's still open, but that's my theory. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they will have a broader implication, but currently we're targeting these internalizing disorders. We're also targeting pain, because chronic pain is a disorder where the brain is the circuit of pain. The site of the pain is long gone. People can have chronic pain when they've lost their leg, so there's no pain coming from the leg. It's all coming from the brain. So again, we might better break those circuits.
Yeah. Thank you. And a quick question to throw in. Are you familiar with real-world evidence? And
yeah, very much so.
So I've been hearing more and more about that. I think I've got a basic understanding. Can you educate me and our listeners about how that is being used or could be used?
So real-world evidence is basically looking to see whether when a medicine or a treatment is used in the real world, does it work? Now, to my mind, real-world evidence is the core of medicine. And I say that for 2 reasons, because no RCT, currently most people think, the best evidence is a randomized controlled trial. You do the drug, you do placebo, and you get the difference. And then you get a significant difference, and then if it's significant and clinically meaningful, then the company can get a license to flog the drug. But RCTs are constrained by the fact you can only put in patients that don't have anything else wrong with them. Now, I'll give you an example. In the drug science, in the medical cannabis initiative, 90% of the people getting prescribed medical cannabis have got more than one disorder. Some have 50% have got 5 or more disorders. They would never be in a clinical trial, but these are the people that GPs are seeing all the time. So RCTs actually don't tell you very much at all. And they're a kind of contrived scheme for licensing. Real world evidence is saying basically, let's take loads of people, let's give them this medicine, and let's see which ones get better and how much they get better and which symptoms get better. And I think that's the future. I think that because that's what we care about. We care about, doctors should care about getting patients better, not doing rare trials, clinical RCTs and rarefied subpopulations.
Great. Yeah, because if you want to know, does this actually work, let's actually do it in the real world. And so your Awaken clinics, you're doing real world evidence with breakthrough treatment. So the data you're collecting there, I assume that's...
That's the plan. We're systematically collecting the same data on everyone, so we can look to see, which disorders do better, whether there are any particular aspects of treatment which are preferable for different disorders. We're trying to build out, and and one of the other things we're doing is we're using the same rating outcomes as the NHS uses, so that we can compare our cost effectiveness with what's going on elsewhere.
Great. All right, this was a lovely ramble. What a pleasure. David, anything you want to tell people about, particularly like where to find more information?
Yeah, obviously follow me on Twitter, listen to my podcast on drug science, follow drug science, buy me books. All the books support the drug science charity, and keep lobbying for change.
Yeah, amen. All right, Professor David Nutt, gentlemen, what a pleasure. Lots of love. Thanks, mate.
Thank you.
And there you go. Thanks for listening to that lovely chat with Professor Nutt. Before you leave, just want to double check. Have you subscribed and liked our Psychedelics Today channel on social media and our podcast on your podcast platforms? If not, then please do so. It just helps us know that we are loved out there. And feel free to go to our main website, psychedelicstoday.com, to catch up on all the other podcasts and check out the events we have coming up. And we also, do a lot of education and training courses, and some of them are free. So you can check out those on psychedeliceducationcenter.com. And if you're feeling particularly generous, then you can make a donation. Patreon.com/psychedelics today. All right, wherever you are in the world, enjoy being alive. God bless.